Good morning, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. We can start this morning by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, the reason why we're gathered here today. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Bhutam dhammam sangham namasami. So this week I've been contemplating a lot actually on the verses of the Dhamma that we chant and how beautiful, in particular the Anapanasati Sutta that I've been trying to memorize. I've been chanting it a lot, and every time I chant these words of Dhamma, I've been contemplating how beautiful they are, how beautiful they sound, how beautiful all the meaning that these words have, how beautiful the instructions, how powerful the Dhamma is. And as these, the mind has been delighted with all these, this sukha, this happiness that comes from the Dhamma, this Dhamma sukha. And also contemplating this really beautiful aspect of the practice. These words of Ajahn Pasanno, when he came to visit us a couple of years ago, started arising again in my mind. And when he was here, he gave us an interesting invitation, which was to reflect on our practice, reflect on every action that we do through body, speech, and mind, asking ourselves, is it beautiful? And I find these instructions so powerful because whenever we contemplate, whenever we see something that is done in accordance with Dhamma, whenever we recite the Dhamma, whenever we reflect on the Dhamma, there is so much beauty in the Dhamma. And so I feel like his invitation to ask ourselves, is this beautiful? So is this thought that I'm thinking, is it beautiful? Or are these words that I'm saying, are they beautiful? Or is this action that I'm doing, is it beautiful? That basically supports us in the practice of the Dhamma. And I was reflecting also, it's been just delightful here at Empty Cloud to see how the lay community, the Vasa, has been coming together to support the Sangha in so many different aspects. Obviously, it has always been like this since the very beginning, since the inception of the organization. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today. There wouldn't be a monastery in West Orange. There wouldn't be a Sangha here in New Jersey. I wouldn't be here, right? So our life depends on others in every possible way. But it has been an interesting Vasa. For the first time, the Sangha has been here at Empty Cloud without any lay people that have been residing during residencies, so supporting the Sangha in any shape or form. So we've been entirely by ourselves with our precepts. And at the very beginning of the Vasa, there are so many questions that also the lay community was asking. It's like, oh, who's going to offer the food? How is that going to work out? How are these things going to happen? In particular, the food. How are you going to eat every day, since you can't just go in the kitchen and open the fridge and eat whatever you want? And you can't, there's so many constrictions, so many impediments. Sometimes we can think, in terms of the Vinaya, in terms of the monastic code. But then in reality, actually, we are all like, well, we don't know. We don't have a plan for this. We'll see what happens. And, if there's no food, we'll just go out, pinta pata, we'll figure things out. And yeah, and it's just been so beautiful to see the concern of all the lay people coming to the monastery, the concern of also all the people that have been listening to the teachings, and the support, the overflowing support that has come to the monastery in so many different shapes and forms. And also people starting to connect with one another in a different way that wasn't only necessarily on certain aspects of the path like meditation, but also on the aspects of really nurturing wholesome qualities of mind, of care, of love, right? So a lot of Brahma Viharas. And is that beautiful? Yes, it's so beautiful, I have to say. So beautiful to see, so beautiful to look at. And so this has been this constant reflection, actually, in my mind, this constant contemplation throughout the week, to also see sometimes instead the ugliness of certain actions, perhaps also certain thoughts in myself, certain thoughts, right, here and there. Like perhaps maybe there's some irritation and going like, huh, is that beautiful? Not really, right? But instead, in the calm, the peace, is that beautiful? Yes, yes, it is, right? So it's the thought, yeah, I don't really like this. I don't want this. I'd rather do this other thing, right? Is that beautiful? Not really. But is it? Oh, is there? How can I help my spiritual companions along the path? Oh, is that beautiful? Yes, it's beautiful. It's beautiful, right? And so gauging that, and also the instructions of the Buddha. There's this sutta, really beautiful sutta, where the Buddha actually talks about newlyweds. So when a couple first gets married and they're very thoughtful with one another, it's the honeymoon is alive and well. Everybody is looking at each other with loving eyes and being so thoughtful and so caring. And then as time goes by, one gets acquainted with one another. And then after a while, it's kind of like, what do you know? What are you talking about? And, we can get a little bit sharp with our tongue. We can get a little bit, not too patient anymore, not being, not being so careful with one another. We get acquainted with that. And it's the Buddha says that also for us monastics, that even though we don't get into worldly relationships like marriages or romantic relationships, right? We don't have children. We don't make children anyway. Maybe we might have children from the past, but we definitely don't make children. We don't build a family of that sort. But yes, we do live in community. And we do have other types of relationships. We have relationships with other monastics, and we have relationships with lay people. And in the same way, the Buddha says, at the very beginning, we might meet our spiritual companions, maybe going to a monastery, and we're like, oh, these monastics, so lovely, so great, so beautiful. And we're so thoughtful and caring. And then after a while, we're kind of like, I don't know about that, Bante. I don't know about that, Ayya. I don't know about that, Venerable, right? Who are you to tell me that? Who are you to say these things? And so then we get a little bit sharp, and we get a little bit, not beautiful. We start doing not a beautiful conduct. And we forget, actually, similar to lay relationships, we forget the reason why we fell in love, perhaps, with the Dhamma. We forget why we are practicing. So we can reflect on, just like in the sort of the simile that the Buddha brings to mind for ourselves as well. If we are lay people, we can also contemplate that. What is it that makes us fall in love? And sometimes we're very projected with the other person, or with the external world in general. So there's lists of things, we like that sort of trait and that other sort of quality. But I remember, actually, as a lay person before Buddhism, when I had madly fallen in love with this person, a certain point, this thought arose in my mind of like, wow, I'm so in love with this person, but actually what I really love is how back then I thought this person makes me feel. And actually what I really meant by that was all those incredible qualities of mine that this perceived love was generating inside of me. So that care, so that thoughtfulness, that wanting for the other person to be happy. And so back then, as an unenlightened asuttava patujana, so uninstructed worldling, so someone who had not encountered the suttas, I really thought that it was, quote unquote, the fault of that person of making my mind, so wholesome. And we tend to blame others for our unhappiness, but we also like blame them for our happiness, as Venerable Rabina Korten, this Tibetan bhikkhuni that I really like. She encourages also to think, to reflect. So in that case, I was, blaming that person for also all these like genuine, beautiful Brahma Viharas that I was dwelling in. And so it's kind of like that, actually. It's very interesting when we really reflect on what are the really beautiful qualities of love, what we call love. It's actually that caring mind. And with Buddhism, we have the instruments to create it independently, right? We understand that that is what is really beautiful, to actually dwell in those divine abidings rather than the infernal abidings. And that we are empowered to always create the conditions so that we can dwell in there. We don't have to kind of randomly just wait for it to be presented to our mind and so that we can enter it, but we can actually like really build those conditions. And getting back to the simile, right, that the Buddha uses, we can really understand, back in the day, it was, those conditions were really ideal for me to enter those divine abidings, whether it's actually if we're in a relationship, perhaps with a loved one, if we're a lay person, or if we're, monastic and we entered a monastic community. So the first time that we entered that monastic community, right, that monastery and so forth, or it's if we're a lay person and we enter, a monastery, right, and then we decide to stay there, right? So what is it that came up in the mind? How were we relating to that space? How were we relating to those people? What were the qualities that were coming about in our mind? And we can actually intentionally bring them up. We can intentionally, as the Buddha says, train ourselves to always, always, always act with that mind of a newlywed, with that mind that is not jaded by just getting acquainted with people, getting comfortable with people, getting comfortable with spaces, but always nourishing those beautiful qualities of mind through body, speech, and mind. Right? All the thoughts that we're introducing, all the things that we're saying, all the actions that we're doing. And the important thing is to understand that it's a training. That's what the Buddha says, is to train ourselves. Obviously, he's talking to monastics, but I think this is such a precious teaching that is relevant also for lay people, that we can all train ourselves in every single moment. And getting back to then the question that Ajahn Pasanno was asking us to do. Is that beautiful? Yeah, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful to see it in ourselves. It's so beautiful to see it in others. It's so beautiful to see all those actions. So we can now conclude with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So these were just a few reflections. So at this point, you have any comments or questions, I'm happy to address them. And good to see you, Bhumika, Richard, John, Mana, Yankee Apple, Sud, Jayanta, Edward, good to see you, friends. Bovan, Gita, haven't seen you in a while, and Pamela as well. Good to see you all, friends. So it's just some reflections this morning that, once again, can be really helpful, I feel, to also just evaluate if our practice is going well, right? And it's just such a simple way to look at things, and actually also a wholesome way of cultivating the mark of the beautiful. Usually we cultivate the mark of the beautiful when we shouldn't be cultivating it, right? So we cultivate it in the way that the Buddha tells us not to cultivate it. And then when we kind of understand that we need to stop cultivating the mark of the beautiful in terms of like objects or sensual pleasure of sorts, then maybe we can get a little bit grumpy and a little bit depressed. But we can actually introduce a wholesome mark of the beautiful. And isn't metta, for example, so beautiful? There's so many beautiful things actually that we can really redirect our minds towards and intentionally nourish. Okay, well, I don't see any questions nor comments except for lots of hellos and Angelis on the comments. So maybe that's all for this morning. And if you have any questions, you can bring them this evening to Longchat. So we'll be meeting at 7:30 p.m. I will be here with Ayya Brahmavara, and we will try our best to answer any questions you might have on Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha at that time. All right, so we can end again with 3 sadhus. Oh, actually, Sud says as a question. Says, Dear Ayya, from my vantage point, my practice has been 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. Is this normal? How does one make it so? It's absolutely normal, Sud. Yes, that's why the Buddha tells us to train ourselves, right? In anything that we're doing, whether it's our meditation practice, whether it's our dana practice, whether it's our sila practice, right? Whether it's also our wisdom, sometimes we can get just really to a point where we feel like we're actually like sidetracking, like we're going back. And I feel that it's because of the unenlightened mind that really starts grasping to things and thinks that they are permanent, that whenever we acquire a particular trait, that becomes us, right? So if, for example, we are generous right now, we think we are generous. Like me, this person is generous. And so then we can become a little bit lazy with our generosity. If, the mind gets concentrated, we think I am concentrated. So we're like, okay, this person really, managed to get this result. But in reality, that is a result that is dependently arisen. So there are different causes and conditions that created that result. And if we don't keep putting those causes and conditions there, then the result will slowly changing, or rather there will be a lingering result from past actions, but then it will start fading away. And so the Buddha actually gives this simile of basically getting a kind of like if we got a pot, like a silver cup from a market, and if it's perhaps all shiny, right? And then we don't do anything with it. We just put it in the cupboard. After a while, it will all get stained, right? Instead, if we get a pot, a silver cup, and it's all stained, and we still don't do anything, we don't polish it, we don't do anything, we put it in the cupboard, it will stay stained. It might get even worse, actually. But instead, if we have a cup, right, and it's part of it is stained and part of it is polished, and we keep keep the polished part polished, and the part that is not polished, we start polishing it, right? So it's an action. Then we'll have, the part that is polished will stay polished, and the part that is not polished will actually start becoming polished. And then ultimately we'll have a really beautiful polished cup. And then that's the same thing with the mind. So we need to constantly keep on cleaning up, polishing essentially what needs to be polished, so cultivating wholesome qualities of mind, but also nourishing the wholesome qualities of mind that are already there fundamentally. So not taking them for granted, but rather always making an active effort to keeping them as they are, and are actually even better, to improve them. So what I would really recommend is not to settle, not to be comfortable, not to be, okay, this is good enough, but rather it's always, this is some really good ambition. Sometimes we're ambitious with so many silly things. We're ambitious with our salaries. We're ambitious with our, fame. We're ambitious with whatever it is, our status in society. But instead, we should be ambitious in terms of like, oh, I'm going to be the most generous person. Oh, I'm going to be, the most kind person, like, and so forth, right? So not out of arrogance, but really out of like really understanding the importance of these qualities of mine, and so really putting an effort into it. And so in that way, then it will be more and more going forward and less slipping back. But to a certain extent, that's part of being unenlightened. We will get back into our strong habits, but we can see how potent the practice of Dhamma is, because we're still moving in the right direction. And so to a certain extent, we also need to be kind and, kind with ourselves and go, okay, well, you're trying your best. That's the right direction. And yeah, sometimes, the kilesas win, and it's okay. It's just part of how things are right now, and it's okay. And Sud also asks, is a little bit of practice better, I guess, than no practice at all? How should one motivate oneself to keep at in terms of development of wholesome actions and avoiding unwholesome ones? I think I addressed this question already. And yes, a little bit of practice is better than no practice at all. But I think actually, Sud, you're completely okay, because you do a lot of practice and you're really a wonderful practitioner. So it's very important also to recollect our own goodness, and you have a lot of goodness, so you have lots to recollect. That can be your meditation practice in and of itself, just recollecting all the good acts, all the good deeds that you do, all the incredible wholesome qualities that you have cultivated. That's just, wonderful. Recollecting your sila, the precepts that you hold, just really beautiful. And so we see that the mind starts delighting in that. And it's really completely wholesome to bring it in the mind and to acknowledge it. And one also creates a positive association towards what is beneficial. And so then it becomes less of a struggle to stop doing what is not beneficial, because we just, kind of like, when we eat a healthy meal as opposed to junk food. When we eat a healthy meal and we recollect, we actually look at the effects on the body, and we're like, oh, this spinach has really nourished, my body. Like, I feel, look at this mind. It's much brighter than the mind that, the brain, rather than mind and brain, that um, instead is foggy when it has like really heavy food. It's the same thing for any kind of anything that is nourishing the mind or not nourishing to the mind, right? We can actually evaluate it in the same way. And Jojo says, there's a lot of teachings about being mindful of the breath, of what we're doing at all times, but at Ajahn Brahmali, we really emphasize previous factors on the path, like virtue instead, saying mindfulness will follow after virtue has been purified. The Buddha said this too, but it's not a popular teaching that I hear, but it makes sense. What do you think is the best approach to mindfulness? I completely agree with Ajahn Brahmali, absolutely, and of course with the Buddha. I think it's not that emphasized too much, because also a lot of people, a lot of perhaps Westerners who might have gotten certain teachings from Asian masters back in the time. Usually the average person who is born Buddhist, since they're very young, since they're born, they hear teachings on Sila. And they're encouraged since they're born to practice dana. So there is something, it's kind of like embedded in the culture. If you go in Thailand, everybody has that. It's like drenched, everything, the whole culture is drenched with all of this wholesomeness. So then when one goes to, say, for example, meditation retreat, or to learn from senior monastic there, or a senior teacher of any sort, usually perhaps they will be emphasizing different aspects of the path. And so when a Westerner goes into that environment, maybe sometimes they will hear very few teachings on Sila. Maybe it's just, kind of practicing the 5 precepts or the 8 precepts, and it's kind of like by default, but there's more emphasis on developing sati and samadhi, right? And they might think that that's all there needs to be done. And so that might be sometimes why that is kind of overemphasized, perhaps in certain Western circles. But it completely forgets where these teachings, are coming from, and what is the base through which, what is the sort of fertile soil where these seeds are supposed to be planted. And that's where I think the lost transmission sort of happens. And that's why it's important, actually, on the other hand, to emphasize Sila, to go back to that instead in the West, so that we make sure that we have, a really nurtured, fertile soil. It's actually, you can have the most potent, the best seeds in the world, but if your soil is actually poor soil, it's kind of bad soil, well, hardly those seeds will do anything, at all. They won't have the conditions to germinate. But if instead one has really great soil, perfect topsoil, and then puts even a bad seed in it, rather than bad seed, kind of crappy, like not the most wonderful seed, well, there will actually be like a really good good plant, right? So it's easier the other way around. We have to really put a lot of effort on the soil. And by bad seed, I don't mean like unwholesome seed. I mean bad seed of like poor quality, maybe like not the best sort of instructions on on meditation practice, not the best vipassana technique as we say it today, maybe, right? But actually one can make a lot of progress with that, with just very few instructions. And Hyang says, how can mindfulness meditation make the mind peaceful in order to develop wisdom? Is too much rigid mindfulness a hindrance to wisdom? can mindfulness meditation make the mind peaceful in order to develop wisdom? I think what you're actually, okay, to get back to also what Jojo was saying, one of my favorite quotes of the Buddha in connection to Sila was that also a happy mind is easily concentrated. So whenever actually we start with making good deeds, we start by purifying the way we speak, the way we act, and the way we think fundamentally. Then there's also just less hindrances altogether in terms of our, say, formal meditation practice. Because first and foremost, we won't have much remorse, right, of our previous actions. Actually, we have, as I was telling Sud, a lot of instead really beautiful things to recollect. Like, oh wow, I've like helped so many different people, so many different sentient beings, or I haven't killed, I haven't stolen, and actually instead of killing, I actually helped, and instead of stealing, I actually gave, right? So it's, instead of lying, I actually spoke the truth. Instead of separating people from one another, I actually reconciliated others. I created opportunities for them to come together again. Instead of intoxicating myself and trying to numb myself to the world, I actually embraced what my experience of reality was. I cultivated equanimity, right? So we can start looking at our experience of reality and actually be quite happy about that. So it's less unsettling, creates less agitation. And so we're also then more ready to be in the experience, to stay there in the experience, to be okay with the present moment, right? To look at the reality of things. And the more we look at the reality of things closely, not trying to pull back from them, but we actually welcome it. We're like, okay, this is what it is. This is how this mind is. This is wholesome, this is unwholesome, or this is dependently arisen from that. We start seeing the nature of things, and then wisdom arises. So it's not some kind of like trippy thing, wisdom, but wisdom is literally understanding, literally, literally creating the conditions for vidya. So for the opposite of avidya, so the opposite of ignorance, to arise in the mind. And obviously, all our suffering comes from avidya, fundamentally. Avidya is at the basis of tanha, which is the cause of dukkha. So the more we cultivate panya, we cultivate wisdom, the more we cultivate knowledge, understanding, the more we eradicate avidya. So the more essentially all our suffering starts shedding away. And so when we talk about too rigid mindfulness, I'm not quite sure what you really mean by that, but it might be when we start approaching the practice in a little bit of a actually untraditional way. And by untraditional, I mean a little bit distant from the teachings of the Buddha, a little bit distant from the teachings of the Dhamma. And so then it becomes just kind of this meditation technique or this method. And then we're kind of like being very, very obsessed with a specific way of approaching or of analyzing our reality, which doesn't necessarily create the conditions for understanding, for wisdom, but rather it just becomes a kind of narrow way of kind of like if we if we drilled a little hole in a wall, and then we were capable of seeing just one little thing that is just one little glimpse, of what is behind the wall. But instead, we're supposed to actually just break the wall altogether, and so that it's not a hindrance anymore, and kind of take it all in. I don't know if that made sense, or if that was a good explanation. Hope my English was capable of can't speak English this morning, so I'm having a little bit of a struggle here and there in communicating, but I hope that made sense. Tinery, good to see you. Dira, yeah, normally when a loved one passes away, naturally the sorrow we feel is that I lost that person. What's another perception of looking at death in terms of Dhamma? Yeah. Thank you for asking that. It's very difficult, obviously, whenever we're experiencing the death of someone that is close to us, that is related to us. That's really actually when we're we're making actually space and room in the mind to contemplate death. Usually we're actually very averse to death. Usually we try to not look at death, even though our experience in reality is constantly of birth and death of everything, even our body itself, like what we think is our body, has actually been born and reborn and died and reborn multiple infinite times in this lifetime alone, without getting into previous lives. But actually scientifically, it's in a constant state of regeneration, a constant state of sort of decay, and a constant state of birth and death. And also when we are going about in the world, we're constantly seeing experiences of birth and death, of decay, of old age. And so, it's I feel like it's a wake up call. It's a divine messenger whenever someone that we know dies, when we are we can't, no matter how hard we try, when we can't kind of exclude this this sort of aspect of existence from our minds. When death kind of like enters our mind, it's a wake up call, right? It's a way of really looking at this divine messenger, that one of the divine messengers that created the conditions for the Buddha to essentially decide to go forth. That the Buddha really had an understanding of old age, sickness, and death, of our intoxication with life, our intoxication with youth, our intoxication with health. We don't really think about it in those ways. Usually we just think of intoxication with alcohol or intoxication with drugs. But actually we're constantly intoxicated, literally. This is what the Buddha says, with youth. Usually anyone that is older than us, when we kind of see the decay of the body, we're kind of like repulsed. We're kind of like, oh, that's gross. And we have that conceit of superiority, that is not our current condition right now, right? Maybe it's not this so lucid, but there's that kind of underlying thought that the mind cultivates. Or when we when we see someone who is ill or has a different illness from ours, if we also have illness, and we're kind of like, well, it's good that I don't have that, but that's kind of gross that person has to go through that predicament, right? So there's that conceit that we're repulsed from their condition, but there's also that conceit of superiority, if you may. And similarly, that's also with death. It's not we have the perception to have a body that is alive versus other bodies that are dead. And we're grossed out by the body. We're grossed out. We're horrified. We're repulsed by the fact that, bodies are of this nature to die. And so the Buddha actually invites us to really take this in and go, well, actually, I really reflect actively. Me too, I am of this same nature. I too will become like that. I am not exempt from that. I'm not exempt from old age. I'm not exempt from sickness. I'm not exempt from death. This is my nature. This is exactly the same. It wouldn't be proper. This is what the Buddha says, actually, when he was an unenlightened bodhisattva, and before, when he decides to go forth, to leave, all the wealth that he had behind him and become a renunciant, penniless renunciant mendicant, was really on understanding the profundity of this existential, essentially, crisis, this predicament that we're in. It's very deep teachings. And also reflecting upon, these conceits that can happen in our minds. And that it's not that we just lost that person, but it's actually like, this is the predicament that we're in. And that also, whenever we have experienced death and that we have mourned and we have cried, we can also reflect on the teachings of the Buddha that says that, all our tears of all the previous lives that we've had are larger than all the great oceans. So we can think of the tears that we have shed, perhaps in moments of sorrow, moments of grief, that actually they're too much to, that not even the great oceans are even comparable. Wow, and amazing, right? And so that should give us a bit of a sense of, like, a little bit of disenchantment, a little bit of not wanting to repeat the same sort of mistake again, over and over again, not be in the same situation of, being born, getting sick, becoming old, and then dying, and being separated by everyone who is close to us. And being separated by everything that we love and that we care about, and doing that over and over again, over and over again, over and over again. So the encouragement is to really understand this predicament and wanting to generate a wholesome desire, which is to end this process once and for all. And Dark Knight says, with practice of anatta, sometimes we also see how people we call ours are so distinct from us, and that is more frightening than calling our thoughts as not ours. Please advise. Well, not sure why you say that it's frightening to see how our people are so distinct from us. It's actually beautiful, but it's also, I mean, not necessarily true that actually other people, it depends on what you're looking at. So I would say that people that we call ours, and also people that we don't call ours, so just people in general, are actually not that different from us. We're all a big jumble of greed, hatred, and delusion, just that it manifests in different ways. This reflection was one of the things that also created the conditions for me to want to go forth. And it's when I started this organization with Bhante Sudaso several years ago, and we started doing all these retreats, and has always been an international community from day one. So there were people from all over the world. And after a while, I started seeing how every single person, didn't matter if they were from, Italy like me, or America, or India, or Iraq, or, South Africa, or Russia or Chile or Guatemala. It didn't matter where people were from. They all kind of had the same questions. They had the same struggles. They had the same delusion. They had the same sort of greed. They have the same aversion. Like, it just kind of manifests slightly different, but fundamentally it's the same exact thing. You know, it's kind of like when you are looking at cats or like dogs. I mean, they all kind of have different sort of personalities maybe, but they're kind of also all the same. Do you see what I mean? Like, we can tend to see that because it's a different species, or like, oh yeah, it's just a cat, it's doing what a cat ought to do. And then, you know, we see the cat, we spend a lot of time with the cats. We're like, oh, this cat, you know, is a little bit more introverted, that cat's a little bit more extroverted. And so in that way, perhaps we can see the differences. So that's the same with maybe people that we care about, with our family members. Then we start seeing, actually, I mean, yeah, there's like a lot of differences. If I think about myself and my brothers, we're radically different people, and we're also the same. So we're the same in the sense of like that Dhamma qualities, or lack thereof, you know, of wholesome qualities, or we're talking about that. But then there's also just different attitudes of mind. And actually, it's very interesting when we see those differences as well as the sameness, because those differences also give us a sense, give us a bit of an objectivity of causality, actually. Because with others who are perhaps experiencing a slightly different predicament than ours, in terms of just worldly predicament, not existential predicament, then we can kind of go like, oh, I see why that person is like reacting in that way, or like, oh, I see how cultivating those habits creates this specific result. And that can give us some insights on ourselves as well. Or like, okay, well, since we're actually not terribly different in terms of how our mind works, how am I cultivating, you know, irritation? How am I cultivating delusion? How am I cultivating greed? You know, it might be a little bit different. Maybe, you know, if someone is obsessed with chocolate and we don't like chocolate, you know, it's kind of like very easy for us to see like, oh, like they're so greedy with chocolate. It's kind of gross. Like, I don't do that. But we're like, well, how does my greed manifest? And we can go like and see it in sort of different other ways. So I'm not sure if that is exactly what you're addressing. And if you have a follow-up question, feel free to write it. And good to see you, Kenneth and Maria. It's lovely seeing you all. Okay, maybe that's all now for this morning. If you have if you have any other question, feel free to bring them up tonight, as I was mentioning, at 7:30 p.m. Like every Friday, we have Longchat, an opportunity to ask questions to the Sangha. So we can end our morning actually, with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May you all be well, happy and peaceful, and may all good things come to you.